Your network is fast. Your plans are competitive. Your app works fine. So why are customers still walking away? Welcome to Next Signal, the podcast that cuts through the noise to find what's actually moving the needle in telecom.
Good day. My name is Jean-Pierre Lacroix. I'm president of SLD. And today we're going to be talking about a very important, critical point. And with me is Will Gibson. Will, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hey, I'm Will from Maplewave. Talk about all things telco, and today all things silos.
Silos, those dreaded silos. So I was reading your blog, which there's a link down below if people want to read it. And the interesting insight was that the customer journey moves sideways while a business still thinks in verticals. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. The customer doesn't really care about which department owns which piece of the puzzle. They just want their thing done with your business. And a lot of businesses, and not just telcos, I'm pretty sure a lot of businesses around the world, we need to employ specialists for sure. But what that ultimately means is the specialists end up owning a chunk of the puzzle. But rarely do the specialists come together and debate and brainstorm issues. Instead, they just solve their chunk of the puzzle. Sales sell. Marketing positions the products, takes them to market, etc., etc. IT keeps the lights on, makes things going. So it's a real problem.
Well, it's interesting because we did a study on the challenges of transformation. We did that in 2020, so 5 years ago. And we asked across banks, telcos, retailers, healthcare providers, we asked them, what are the challenges of transformation? And not just digital transformation, but transformation within an organization, change management, if you like. And the number one issue was that it's department centric. It is one department that starts a transformation and it's kind of singular minded about what the outcome is. And the second point is that there's a lack of resources, and you talk to both of these, a lack of resources to effectively implement the transformational program. So let's talk about the first one, which is it's typically driven by a department. Now you work, with multiple telcos. So tell me, from an outside in view, when you're hired to do a transformational program, what are the things that you notice and see?
Absolutely. It's interesting how I often move sideways in an organization. I may be brought on by a client to solve a particular challenge. Let's say what I'm doing right now is retail store design. And so I immerse myself in the business. I walk a mile in their shoes. I understand the challenges that they're facing. And of course, then I'm going to have some experience and some ideas and things that I've seen in many other telcos around the world. So I'll give that. But often what I find is that part of the problem that they're facing sits elsewhere in the organization. And they almost kind of look at me and say, well, can you fix that for us? And I'm like, well, yeah, I can give you some ideas. However, let's bring in X department and have a discussion with them so that we're all on the same page. And it's almost kind of like a light bulb moment goes on. It's like, oh, well, why didn't I engage them myself in the first place? So I often do have some funny conversations in the clients that I work with, and JP, I'm sure you're the same.
Well, it reminds me of a major transformation program we're doing for a large U.S. retailer, and we did our discovery session, and we were brought in by the head of a division, but there were multiple divisions within this company, and there was a holding company president, and we're ready for a 2-day executive brainstorming session. And I've got a kickoff. Here's, what success looks like, and here's what we're going to do. And there's one of the presidents raises their voice and says, well, that's not what I thought this exercise is about.
Oh.
I thought we were doing this. And obviously pause, gain an internal alignment of what is the task at hand that we need to accomplish. And I believe that a lot of these transformational programs face the same challenges. We may not be party to those conflicts because they're behind closed doors, and that was a rare exception. But how do you break down those silos, Will?
I very clearly lay it out, and I ask for the introduction. I think that's one of the biggest tips I'll give anybody listening who's in my position, certainly as a vendor in the industry. I'll just straight out say, who owns this, and who do we need to speak to internally, and can you make me that introduction? I think from sitting at the other side of the fence, and my blog does talk about two perspectives. One is being a vendor into the business. The other is actually being inside of that business. And that often, I think, is, it separates the really great executives from just pretty much everybody else who happens to be in an executive position. The ones who leave their ego at home, the ones who are collaborative, who can talk to somebody else with a very different lens on the world, in a very different function, say, hey, this is something I'm trying to solve for. This is a problem I've got. What's your take on this? How can we join forces and work together? That is something very powerful in an organization. And if you have an executive that displays those behaviors, I think they often are going places.
Will, I was reading your blog, and you made a comment in your blog, which I thought was really insightful. Is a room big enough for the problem? Can you explain what that means, and how do you solve that?
Sure, absolutely. Telcos will often make some decisions, and they will try to differentiate their services. All businesses do that, and they'll try to move and they'll try to grow. And it's interesting. I work with a telco who has made some diversions into the gaming world. They operate in a very young, growing market. A lot of digital natives are their customer base, and they even sell a lot of gaming packages online. Yet you go into their retail stores, and there's no mention. There's no marketing materials. The stores themselves are not incentivized to think about those plans or try to sell them. So that's a gap that I identified in one of my clients, and again, was able to work with their executives to really come up with some positive ways in which they could align the business to that problem. The problem was they weren't diversified. They came up with a solution, great solution, but they hadn't thought through the many layers of execution. And that's again because all of the silos were just operating independently.
So yeah, in your article, you talk a little bit about bringing more people to the party when you have that problem. So the more complex the problem is, the more you want to include a broader spectrum of people. And I think you're talking to that point. And what is getting in the way for that to happen?
I think sometimes it's just everybody has their slightly different priorities, and they're slightly focused in different areas. So it's who is really governing which direction each of the departments are moving in, and who is governing the bringing together of the team. It's to coin a sports analogy. Do I need to bring the various different teams in my offense together to talk about the plays we're going to run? Or am I just going to leave them to it because they're smart people and they're going to figure it out? They're great athletes. So I think it's often a couple of things in telcos for sure. It's who's bringing them together, and if nobody is bringing them together, then who's governing the separate directions that they have.
Would you say though that part of the problem is twofold? One is who owns the budget, because we see that all the time, right? That hey, listen, it's our budget, and part of this implies marketing, but that's not part of our budget. So you need to carve out some money from your budget to do this initiative. Well, our budget is tied up. That's number one. And the other one's measurement, which is, how does success get measured? And very often organizations compensate, reward their different executives differently depending on what the metrics are. Do you see that happening in telcos? We see it in a lot of other industries, but what about telcos?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, firstly, the budget situation is a real challenge, and I do see it happening. People try to protect their pot of gold, and I try to bring the executives together and say, well, hey, it's not three different pots; it's one pot from the company. So how are we spending things in the right way? So that's a challenge. In terms of the other piece that you mentioned, around people really thinking about what it is that they want to do and what it is that they want to accomplish. That's again something that I try to bring people towards, because what gets measured can be incentivized, and what gets incentivized absolutely does change the behaviors. And the classic thing I see all the time, particularly in telco, is that sales or retail will be incentivized on what they sell. Yet perhaps the business or the brand is often moving in another direction. And I know, JP, you have your Think Blink tenets, and I talk to a lot of my clients about those as well. I often talk to them, particularly in telco retail, about immersion into the brand. That's one of your Think Blink tenets. How are the customers being treated inside your stores? What's the CX metrics? Dwell time. Do you want your customers to come in, be sold to, and leave straight away? Or do you want them to come in, feel something, feel more connected to the brand? And often that ideal is not present in the incentives for the people in the retail channel. So it creates a disconnect.
Yeah, I think it's one of the key drivers. We did a study on measuring what matters 2 years ago across multiple industries. And what we found out was that a lot of the metrics are rear view mirror viewing, and they're conventional, traditional metrics, ROI, even NPS scores, as we both know, are not clear indication of customer loyalty, but they don't measure ROX. And the smart ones are starting to measure ROX, return on experience, looking at those friction points, those emotional connections. That's tenet one in my book. But I wanted to highlight another point. In your book, you talk a lot about breaking down these silos. What we've like you face when we implement major transformational programs, we face challenges between the silos. And what we found very effective is a project charter. And we clearly identify from day one the different departments and their roles in the transformation. And they may be a secondary role, but they are listed as responsible for a certain part of that transformation. And we get all of the executives to sign it. And so there's visibility to the commitment. And I think a lot of times the challenge is a lack of visibility to the commitment. It's kind of soft shoe. Yeah, it's their project. It's not our project. Yeah, they've asked us to help, but there's nothing there that links me back to that project. And so having a commitment, signed commitment, and then having that signed commitment visible across the organization is a very powerful tool. What's your thoughts on that?
No, I absolutely love that. I think it's something very powerful, because you can then be working with your champion and working with whoever's brought you into the organization. But simply with the existence of this document and the fact that it's then being pushed to certain people and say, you need to acknowledge this and you need to acknowledge the pieces that you're partly responsible or accountable for. I think that's a genius way to kind of multi-thread, I guess, an organization and make sure that you're connecting with all of the different parts with the aim of bringing them together and getting the right result for the customer, because that's what it's all about at the end of the day.
It is. I was this morning driving into the office listening to a podcast, The Immortal Life of Agencies, and Robin was interviewing an agency owner. And he says the biggest challenge is there is a disconnect between the CEO and the CMO. In other words, the organization is not living the vision of the CEO. They're interpreting the vision differently than how the CEO. And I see that coming apart so often where we do a big project And then it's presented to the board and the CEO, and it's like, where did this come from? Why are we doing it this way? Do you find when you're working with telcos that you face that challenge, that where you've made recommendations on an operating platform, a sales strategy, customer service experience, and then that's taken up to the executive level and there's a disconnect, or a lack of alignment? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, it does happen. And particularly, certainly when you get into some of the larger organizations, I do find that the larger the organization, that sometimes the more removed some of the executive team can be from the day-to-day of the business. And I think, a lot of executives get so kind of stuck into trying to meet their objectives, trying to solve the problems, that they miss that connection with the floor, with the customer base in particular. And it just means, they're thinking boardroom speak rather than thinking in ideas that are going to move the needle for their customer base and ultimately for their profitability.
Yeah, that's great. Let's just take a pause for a quick commercial break on our AI assessment tool for transformation. So as organizations are looking at transforming their brand, this assessment tool is very powerful at getting to understand how these silos all work together. So let's take a quick break, half a minute.
If you enjoy the insights in this podcast, please hit the like and subscribe buttons. If you are wondering if your telco brand needs a transformation to ensure it remains relevant as AI is impacting how people purchase your services, please take a few minutes to take our online transformation assessment. You will receive insights based on our industry benchmarks on areas you can improve and remain competitive. Now let's get back to the pod.
Welcome back. Will is with me. We're talking about telcos and breaking down the silos. So Will, when you look at silos and when things are not going smoothly, there's a blame game happening. So how do you overcome that? What advice would you give telcos?
Sure. One of the things I always do, whether the client asks for it or not, is I'll set a number of KPIs for the transformation project. And I'll break that down by some of the different work streams often. But I'll be sure to kind of almost predict or project what are some of the objectives that we'll achieve inside those work streams. And that'll be based on where the business is right now, where they've come from, where they're going. But it'll also be based on a lot of historical norms that I've seen across my, many hundreds of projects over many years around the world. And I find focusing people on that, on the future facing, this is where we're going and this is what we're going to see, really helps kind of avoid that blame game. But it does happen. And when it happens, I think it's very important to stay calm and to remind people of the original objectives and of the things that everybody agreed with up front, and then move forward into setting out those KPIs and really having a path to achieving them and making sure that they're met.
Good. And that brings back another really important point in your blog, and that is the idea of customer journey mapping. And very often customer journey mapping is done by operations or marketing. It's not a holistic view. In your article, you talk about that. So talk a little bit about what's the right way of doing customer journey mapping.
Yeah, I often see CX own customer journey mapping and do it quite a lot in telcos. And I think what they're trying to connect there are, the basic telecoms journeys of somebody getting a package, signing up. How do they, add to that plan or package or recharge it if it's prepaid? And then what happens to the lifetime of that? And that's really interesting. But I like to think of customer journey mapping a lot wider than that. And I certainly like to tie them to customer personas and what types of customers are doing what types of things in your business. And how are they able to use your different touch points and your channels. And this is often where CX solely leading these types of projects can often fall down, because they'll forget a lot of the physical channels. And they'll also over-index a lot of channels that come under their control. So, they'll talk a lot about the call centers and the inbound and the outbound journeys, when actually that might make up only 40% of the entire transactions of that particular telco. So it's really important to think about all of your customers and who they are, what drives them, how old are they, what's their demographic, what's their purchasing power, what are they trying to do. And I think the telcos that do that well do reap the benefits of that for sure.
Let's talk about the benefits of breaking down the silos. Do you have any kind of measurement or performance examples of organizations that have broken down the silos, have worked, in unison, if you like, holistically across the different divisions?
Yeah, in terms of the businesses that I see that do it well, will have very, very successful projects. Now, typically, and JP, you know me, and you're very much the same. We're two very tenacious gentlemen, I'd say. And so we don't have failed projects. Just some have slightly more speed bumps in them compared to others. So I think it's not saying that people who are not connected will have failed projects, because, through the drive of us and our collective teams, we both work with some very, very talented people. We'll guide the client towards the right solution for sure. But I think some clients I've had are from the get-go, they'll introduce me, go and talk to this person, go and talk to this person. Let's have a meeting with this particular department. And we'll talk about edge cases. We'll talk about things around the outside quite a lot. And I find when I do that, the project is incredibly successful for the long term. And often those clients I'll end up working for longer with. I find the clients where they do have a lot of internal silos and I'm the one who's constantly trying to bring people together, I find often that can lead to some pauses in some of the projects. And then I've got to work really hard to kind of bang heads together to bring them back. And so some of those are a little bit more challenging, but hey, it's what we do, right?
Yeah, another observation I would have is, time is money. So the time you're not in market with your transformation is actually costing you money because it's not driving growth. And so when you have a siloed structure and you have those disconnects between the departments, very often you delay the project. We were working on an assignment 4 or 5 years ago, and the merchandise group weren't aligned with the marketing group. And it took 3 new prototypes to get it right. They could have had it right the first time, but because they weren't aligned and supportive, it delayed the outcome of the project. And I think that, delays are costly for organizations, both from a consulting fee standpoint, from a speed to market. And today we both know, Will, the speed to market is as critical as, increased sales. The ability of getting there with the idea and being agile and getting there is critical. Mm. So I just want to wrap up here. If you were to list 4 or 5 things or strategies that telcos need to consider when trying to break down these silos during a transformational program, and those transformational programs could be small, or they could be, massive. What would you recommend? What would be the 4 or 5 things you would recommend them do?
I think the first one for the executives themselves is stop being, and I'll say, and I can say this because I'm British and Canadians are very similar, right? We're polite people. Yeah. Okay? Stop being so polite. Stop thinking that, that's not my job. I can't tread on somebody's toes. It's their job. No. You've got a problem and it's a problem. Don't wait for somebody else. Don't assume somebody else is going to do it, or don't pass that particular book. Raise the problem. Do something about it. That's the number one thing. If you're an executive in telco, make things happen. I think aside from that, I think number 2 is about just being very conscientious with your projects. I think bring your other departments in so that they know, just out of courtesy. So that would be the second thing is be collaborative, be open. You've got nothing to hide. Don't just put your head down. And even if you've got nothing to hide, don't just put your head down and just focus on running through that tunnel as fast as you can. because you're going to leave a wake of people behind you. So just slow down every now and again and bring them on that journey with you. I think the third thing, and it's kind of the converse of that, is I mentioned this in my blog, this phrase, calendar vandalism. So don't go the other way and just constantly, be almost afraid to make a decision unless absolutely everybody else has ticked that box. Because that, as you mentioned, is going to slow everything right down. So I think there's a balance to be had there. So I think those three would probably be the core things that I would say is, do make things happen, but be collaborative, but don't be over collaborative and slow things down on purpose.
Great. Those are great pieces of advice. I would have a couple more that I would add to your list.
Cool.
Yeah, I'd say start with a project charter.
Nice.
So
I
that
love
everyone has sight lines to the assignment, big or small. Have a project charter. Make sure that the CEO and the COO sign off on it. Make sure that they have sight lines and they're aligned, because there's a lot of disconnect happening between the implementation team and the leadership team, and going quarterly in to present is too late. And so number two is having kind of established meeting times where you bring the whole team together, because everyone has to your point, everybody has busy calendars. And for us, very often the delays come from the client side, not because the project's not important, but because everyone's busy and their calendars are tied up. So really planning ahead and making sure that the right people are at the right meeting by giving them pre-scheduled meeting times is really critical. And the last thing is back to your original comment. Well, I think metrics, organizations are driven by metrics, and having the right metrics from day one for what success looks like is critical.
Excellent. No, that's really good. Really good.
Good. Well, Will, thank you very much. I hope audience you have enjoyed the conversation and the input. And please read Will's blog. There's a link down below. And send us some text. We're both on LinkedIn. Send us notes. Give us your thoughts on our podcast. Thank you very much. Thank you, Will.
Thanks very much. See you soon.